everybody. Very, very honored to come here to speak about the results of the Panama meeting. The most of the presentation is based on information from the UNEP Secretariat itself that has worked through the outcomes and what's now been decided and what will be the next steps. So, and then I also wanted to build a bridge from there to our community here, to what that means for finally getting engaged with the scientist. So from establishment to operationalizations of the IPBES, then I guess I have to use this that way. The talk will be largely structured in two ways. So on the one, first is the direct outcomes and agreements, and then the next steps. What we have been faced with when we went to Panama was, after 7 years, including the IMOSE process, of talking about an IPBES, we had two things. We had a large, or incredibly large, political commitment and willingness to actually establish IPBES. That was very interesting after a long struggle. And we had an impossible agenda to deal with in Panama because so many things were actually left open. So very early on in this week, we came around to an agreement. The only way to actually establish it at that meeting was to go for a really bare minimum of what is necessary to establish a platform. That bare minimum included the general outset of the functions, operation principle, and the higher level of institutional arrangements of the platform itself, and an agreement on all the other work which will be pushed forward to the next meeting, or the intersessional work to that. So I first talk about what actually has been agreed as the bare minimum to establish it, and then I come to the agreement on what's the intersessional work. The most important part, of course, is that after 7 years, which gave some people enough time to do a PhD on it, IPBES has been established. As a platform which is independent and intergovernmental, and will be members, or the members of it will be UN state members, eventually regional integrated organizations as well. That hasn't been solved yet. Will be administered by one or more of the UN agencies. That again has not been solved yet completely. I mean, that's one of them will be doing it for sure, but it might be all 4 of them. And we will also have not yet finally discussed which will be additional links to the UN system, or whether there will be additional links to the system. So much to the legal status. The other very great important news, especially for Europe, is that the location of the Secretariat will be in Bonn. So based on a competition, on offers which were received, including Seoul from South Korea, Kenya, Nairobi, Paris, and Bonn, and India. There was a voting procedure which was very interesting and exciting, and then at the end of it, through 4 rounds of election, we got Bonn as the agreed location of the IPBES Secretariat. Then coming to the structure of the IPBES, so it was, as I said, it was decided to only go for those which are absolutely bare minimum, which is to have the minimum of the structures in place to have the first plenary, and not really to start its work in terms of scientific work, but to start to have just the first plenary. So obviously we needed to agree on the plenary, who becomes a member of it, who becomes an observer of it, what does that entail. The plenary will be the main decision-making body. Then we have, on top of that, a bureau. So from the plenary, there will be 1 chair and 4 vice chairs. They form the core of the Bureau, and there will be an additional 5 members from each of the 5 UN regions which will support these 4 chairs and vice chairs and chair, so that they together form the Bureau and they together oversee the administrative functions of the platform throughout the continued time, so not only at the plenary meetings. And then most of the time we spend actually discussing about the multidisciplinary expert panel, the so-called MEP, which is, its function is to oversee the scientific and technical functions. And there was a lot of discussion on, what kind of setup this should be, who should be the people there, what it's supposed to be doing, what are its functions, does it do science, does it do much of the interface, or is it just overseeing it, and what would all this entail? There was very interesting discussions, and for me personally, this is the idea where the real idea of the interface between science and policy culminates in kind of the overseeing functions of the IPBES. So you have the plenary, which is more the politics side or policy side, and you have the scientist, which is the scientific side, and then you have the MEP, the expert panel, which oversees and ensures the good governance of an IPBES and gives advice to different other things, hopefully, which we'll, again, still have to sort out in the intersessional work. This multidisciplinary expert panel is called multidisciplinary because it's supposed to not be only scientific, but also include other members of the knowledge community, including indigenous or local or non-scientific knowledge, and also policy experts. It will generally include a set of people mandated or nominated by regions, and including all these different elements of knowledge, of the knowledge community. So there will be, at the moment, there will be an interim composition of this, because again, we couldn't really agree on what exactly will be the methodology of or composition of the long-term map, because it wasn't able, or we weren't able to agree on what kind of regional setup we would use. Like, we all decided that the pure political UNEP or UN regions would not do the job really well, but we ended up this being the interim position where we start off from. But then we will have, and I come back to that later, a discussion on what kind of regional setup. Is it biogeographical regions based on the IUCN setup, or is it another or a regional setup from where we can draw or nominate the different members? So these members will be scientists, policy experts, etc., and representative of knowledge communities. Plus, as observers, the chairs of the scientific subsidiary bodies of the MEAs, for example, of SAPSTA from the CBD, and of the IPCC. Other institutional or operating issues we decided on was a secretariat. Again, for the moment, that's interim. So interim secretariat will be the UNEP secretariat that has done it so far, with Neville Ash leading this team, supported by all the others, UN agencies, UNESCO, FAO, and UNDP, until we have the first plenary, and where we have then finalized the procedures or the principles for the secretariat, and then the secretariat itself will be set up in Bonn. We also decided that there will be one core trust fund for the funding, which will include a very broad general trust fund for collecting all the voluntary contributions, which will not be earmarked. So the idea is to have a trust fund that really covers neutrally all the different needs of the IPBES as has been decided by the plenary, and not that one country or one party goes and say, okay, we want to put X money here to finance this and some money to finance that, but that, some issues which have been agreed largely by the plenary would not get funded. So that is the idea, to have just one fund, which is no earmarked money, which contributes to all the different requests or needs of the work program. Now, coming to the working, and also we did not talk about budget yet, because that was still for the future, and there was still too unclear what exactly all would be entailed in the work program and how this would work, or how many meetings we'll have per year. So that was also left for later. And of course, as you can imagine, the working groups, the actual question of how all the work program and the work will be done at the scientific level, beyond the plenary and beyond the MEP, that was all left for future discussions. There are some ideas how that might work, but there has been not finalized discussion on it. And this is one of the parts where I see a very clear link to what we have been discussing here, and how this might then work. And on one hand is working groups to, or task forces, or whatever work structures doing the work of the IPBES just underneath on the global level, and then the other part would be regional structures that could also be thought within this group of, within this cluster of institutional setups. Rules of procedures, of course, we focused mainly on rules of procedures of the plenary, or only, and even there we still have some gaps. Most important gaps is there's all what I said was interim, so interim part of the MEP setup, interim secretariat, and then for the plenary procedures of the plenary itself, one important discussion which is unresolved, and I suppose will remain unresolved for quite some while, is the question of voting. The question whether there should be voting on substantive issues, or issues other than just procedural issues, for example, voting for a chair, or election of a chair, or a selection of a location of a secretariat, for example, as we did have one for Bonn. So there were some people that actually wanted to vote on substance. Personally, I see that very difficult, because it will be difficult, it will be unthinkable to vote on the result of an assessment, for example, whether that is like this or like that. So that's unthinkable. And one could rather think, okay, one might want to vote on the scope of an assessment, for example. What should be included in the scope or not. But even then, to really define stuff like that on a highly political level, at the global level, is almost impossible. And for that matter, I think that part of rules or ideas will stay in square brackets, so unresolved, for quite some time. Or it will be decided that there will be no voting at all, and then you will have it solved. But that will be the only way. The other part of the rules procedure for plenary is that the European Union, or the regional integrated organizations, have been ideally thought, or should be part or members of the platform as well. But there have been some divergence in views on what that would entail, and we are still working towards resolution of that rule as well. Now, on the work program, again, I already said that most what we discussed were so general that we didn't get into the details of the work program at all. So basically, it was decided, as already in Busan, the work program will entail the four elemental structures of support to knowledge generation that IPBES will do regularly and timely assessments at different level, from global, regional, and sub-regional. It will support policy formulation and implementation through tools and methodologies, such as, for example, I think it's a very good example what Jackie McGlade just presented. And finally, but importantly, also the capacity building elements to support the work of the IPBES. All the work what that will entail, or the details of how this will be drawn out and what that will be all about, the work program has been also delayed. It has been fairly confusing because on the one hand, we talked about what are the different elements of a work program, what's the scope of a work program, and what are the actual detailed actions of a work program. I mean, is it an assessment of X, Y, Z, or just general an assessment and capacity building? So there was confusion about this in the debate, and it was just way too much to get a grip on in this meeting. So we also there was an agreement to postpone this for intersessional work, and then to get a first agreement on the first initial work program at the first meeting later on. Which brings me to the next step. So then that was almost, apart from establishing the whole thing and getting the structure right, the most important agreement, the second most important agreement of this meeting was what to do in the intersessional work and give it a proper mandate so it can be done to the next meeting, to not lose again another year of time. So there was a whole series of work elements being agreed, what should be then done through the Secretariat and all contributing parties. Mainly, or roughly, I'm just going to go through this rather quickly, procedures of the platform operation. So there will be some more requests and work done on closing the gaps of the procedures, rules of procedures for the plenary. And so views will be collected, and then will be a new suggestion will be elaborated by UNEP secretariats, or by the secretariats of the 4 agencies, and then that will be presented for the first plenaries. Then also for the secretariat of the platform, UNEP and the 4 other agencies, UNESCO and FAO and UNDP, have proposed to have a joint administrational effort to host administratively the IPBES. That proposal has been thought to be insufficient in terms of detail, and so they have been sent back to do a bit more of homework. Again, that will be happening in the intersessional work and will be tabled then for the first meeting, and hopefully then agreed. Coming to office and structures of the subsidiary bodies, already now in the intersessional works, to be ready for the first plenary, there will be nominations of officers for the Bureau and the MEP. So the chair, the 4 vice chairs of the platform, plus their 5 supporting members of the Bureau, plus the MEPs, the 25 times 25, plus the observers, which are clear, but the 5 times 5 members of the multidisciplinary expert panel will also be nominated early enough so that 4 months in advance of the plenary there will be a list of people nominated, so that at the first meeting these can be then elected to start their work. There will also be intersessional work on what is the structure and composition of this MEP. There was, for example, and as I already mentioned, the discussion on what kind of regional configuration this should be based on. It should not be based on a purely political one as the UN regions. It should also, it's questionable whether it should be based on a purely biogeographical one, or which one, because there are endless numbers of configurations. And the next question was whether these regions should be all getting the same numbers of votes or of members, or whether that should be weighted in form of populations or economic weight, or etc., etc. So that was all open, and that discussion still has to be taken place. There's a lot of good examples. The IUCN regions, the IPCC has its own way of doing this, CITES as well, etc., etc. So we will have to find a smart way of doing this for the IPBES, and finding a solution there which will work and serve its purpose. Then the preparation for an initial work program, and this is maybe what is the most interesting for people here, and for work that actually finally starts to involve more in substance also the scientific community. So to facilitate discussion of the initial work program at the first meeting, there will be produced and then reviewed an overview of assessment, so sort of a mini assessments of assessment. The idea was not to engage in something like the GRAME or the assessment of the marine assessment, which took a few years and was a never-ending saga. Well, it did end, but it did end. But only a few months ago, since how many years? 4 or 5 years. So the idea is to avoid this and come up with a very concise overview of assessment which already exists and have that reviewed and discussed. A conceptual framework, a capacity building needs assessment, what is needed, a process for considering requests from governments, and then also the scoping of the processes towards the requests. We're going now a bit in detail. So again, I said the catalog of assessment will include all the different thematic and comprehensive assessments at national, regional, sub-regional and global levels which are existing already. It does a comparison to it of them, and then there will be a review with everybody been able to contribute to this, and then it will be enhanced and said where the gaps are and what should be taken as standards, or the idea is to move towards a harmonization and the filling of the gaps of his assessments. Then the conceptual framework, which is extremely important, which is, I think, one of the most important things, and which also will be based upon the review of the assessments, is to really find what is the general scope of thinking of the IPBES, biodiversity and ecosystem service. So how will the balance be struck between biodiversity and ecosystem services? So the idea is to build upon existing assessment conceptual frameworks, such as the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and include all the other work within it, and then come with an idea of how this will be further developed within the IPBES. And that one, UNEP Secretariat with some experts will provide a first draft, which will then be put out for discussion, and then for further elaboration through the MEP and scientific community. There will be linked to this item, there will be, of course, also a workshop kind of like meeting, of which the location and date and time and composition is still under discussion, as I understand. For capacity building, that is still a very interesting, and has been for the African or the G77, the developing countries, one of the key point. But very often there was a lack of understanding of what actually in detail that would mean, other than broad-based, we need more capacity building. So there are some ideas out there been formulated, but there will be now a process of trying to get a lot more in-depth, detailed ideas of how capacity building could be actually done, which is within the remit of the IPBES, which is capacity building to support the interface between science and policy. So there will be something on improving the supporting mechanisms for the science policy interface, promoting, of course, sub-global assessment activities, and to include people to do that. There will be contributions to national and regional structures of excellence. Then there's the idea of including capacity building on processes for matching needs and resources to really find out where the gaps of knowledge and where the gaps of policy making, where they can be matched. And of course, ensuring a balanced participation, which is critical to the legitimacy and the functioning of an IPBES at large. And then finally, a process for requesting and scoping. So the idea is to get a grip on, before the first plenary starts, to get a grip on how will be the requests which should be coming from UN member states and also from other types of observers and MEAs, etc. How all this will be structured, channeled to the IPBES Secretariat or to the IPBES platform, and how then that will be scoped and categorized and prioritized, so that at the plenary, at each plenary, then there can be taken an informed decision on what actually should be done. So all this work, what I mentioned, which will be intersessional work, will be happening from now on to feeding comments and input back to UNEP Secretariat in mid-September. So this is really from, it's going to be hot summer in that sense. So that's going to be the critical time of how to do all this work, and at least for the latter part of what I presented here and the work program input, or initial work program, the input from your community, from you here, will be very, very important to get that right, because it will be setting the stage then for the first plenary, which is very likely to be in January 2013. So, I mean, the timing of there was, of course, depending on many things, but mostly on giving enough time to have all this large of bulk of intersessional work being able to finish. So 2013 is likely to be the first plenary. Location will still be determined. Likely, I guess there's a good chance that it will be Bonn. But from my information from UNEP, it's still not decided. Maybe they don't like the weather in Bonn in January, which I could understand. So that's the first plenary. So really, again, the link towards the science community has so far been, well, let's say the other way around. So far, the IPBES discussion, especially in the last stages, has been extremely highly political, not very scientifically substantive, at least from the natural science point of view. For someone studying political science, that was highly interesting, but anyway, not very much from the real, what we think of, the interface between science and policy and biodiversity, and it has been very global. I mean, it's been focused on the global level. But, and that was one really very interesting notion which led throughout the most of the discussion, but really culminated in Panama. The two underlining streams of feelings of what this should all be about is a bottom-up approach. Really build the link with the local needs for policy making and the local links to knowledge. So, I mean, it was really a strong verve towards making it possible to link towards the global with the local levels of knowledge generation and policy making. While we have agreed only on the very bare minimum on the global, there needs much work to be done at the local, I mean, how to bridge this, and this is also part of what's the intersessional part, this intersessional work now is about, and that will continue, because we won't be going anywhere near towards, for example, what kind of regional structures will be decided at the first meeting. That's something which will be, and we will ensure and hope to ensure that all the doors for these regional connections and regional structures will remain open, or as open as possible, to make that link happen. But that will be really still working. And the other second very important verve on what this is all about is also contradicting to the ambience itself, or the work itself, which was very political, as I said, is the idea of remaining scientific credibility in the whole work of it. So, I mean, while we were really highly politically discussing and fighting and all over this on the global level, the main threats where this all should end up was a bottom-up approach, or a very local or sub-regional, regional focused platform that is highly scientifically credible. And to really make that happen, we need you. So we need the engagements of the scientific community to the largest extent possible. And that, as I said, will start, like your engagement of the scientific community will start basically now by trying to shape conceptual framework and the initial work program, etc., etc., and then we'll start on. Because I know that many of you have, or some scientists have been highly frustrated with the last 2-3 years of this process where they were largely excluded from these political discussions, or maybe not excluded, but bored. Anyway, so thank you much for your attention. And for further information on the real clear, the results, etc., please go to the IPBES website, the report of the meeting, including the annexes of what's been decided and rules, procedures, structures, etc., and the intersessional work will be online, I think, today or tomorrow. And then, yes, everything else will also be posted over this website, kind of incoming requests, etc., etc. Okay, thank you very much.